difficult. The B word. Embraced the subversiveness of being a woman who wielded the guitar like a man.
We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true.
Sir, be so for real right now. They'll go to the other extreme and say that she has representing a kind of punk rock feminism, maybe symbolically, if not actually redundant. In summary, Gail said, "Child, you ain't transgressing nothing."
When you're ahead of your times, can also mean that you're ahead of your country.
The organization was like, "Sis, white people are looking at you." It's outright blasphemous.
Oh, Lord.
You good? Bonjour, folks. I'm Sass. I work with sound as a tool for identity, documentation, and storytelling. For over a decade, I've done sound for film and podcasts, and I create custom soundscapes for journaling, healing, and embodiment through my sonic wellness platform, Home Frequency. This series is about sound and listening, not as background, but as forces that shape who we are, how we remember, and which stories are amplified or silenced. From oral histories in music, to recorded archives, to the soundtracks and soundscapes of our everyday lives. Welcome to the Sound Continuum. Bonjour, folks. Welcome to this Women's Heritage Month episode of the Sound Continuum. The theme we've been celebrating all month long is Unbecoming, Unapologetic, Undone, Unbound. And there were a handful of factors that influenced my choice of these words. When you look at the current socio-political landscape and its discourse, this is one of the first time frames in recent history that women in Western societies en masse have the legal, financial, and social capacity to build independent lives on their own terms. And when I was thinking of the sociocultural commentary that I wanted to tie in with the topic of sound in order to show applicability in a larger context, these are the specific words that, to me, capture the energy of this moment. So I reflected on the types of women that society has historically classified as unbecoming, unapologetic, undone, or unbound. And it was musicians like Joan Jett, Madonna, and the genres of punk and rock and roll that first came to mind. Of all of the creative mediums, I think music is the one that provides the most somatic way for women to express themselves through their literal voices and bodies, because it's a format through which other people might be willing to actively listen, acknowledge their experiences, and engage with them. With a medium like writing, even if you leave it all on the page, so to speak, it's still a very cerebral, contained form of self-expression. An actress in theater or film or television is usually playing a character. And although actors often bring aspects of themselves and their lived experiences to a role, they're still disconnecting and filtering themselves through the lens of a fictional self. But a singer-songwriter who performs their own work, whether alone or to an audience, can engage in a kind of personal storytelling and transmutation of their emotions through the use of their voice, their body, and musical instruments in what can be a transcendent process. Over the course of this episode, we'll define unbecoming, unapologetic, undone, and unbound through examples of female musicians and cultural movements. I should state that while the first three words are interchangeable in the sequence, becoming an unbound woman is the ultimate destination. And what does that mean? To me, An unbound woman is liberated. She is physically, spiritually, mentally, and financially sovereign. She is the captain of her own ship, and she is charting her own life's course. So what does it take to become an unbound woman? Well, first, you might have to start engaging in some unbecoming behaviors. You may be familiar with online discourse about the good girl, which is a term that describes the narrow role, character traits, and cultural script that shape what quote-unquote good girls and young women should aspire to become. The good girl is obedient to the point of deference, especially towards authority figures like parents, teachers, and school administrators, and later on, their husbands and men in general. She is self-sacrificing to the point of self-abnegation, which is the complete abandonment of her own desires and interests in order to be of service to others. She is soft-spoken on the rare occasion that she does speak. She wears feminine clothing and makeup, which strikes a balance between making her desirable to men, but of course, not in a way that's provocative. When the good girl reaches adulthood, her sole ambition is to be a wife and stay-at-home mother, who is content to spend her days doing the unpaid labor of running a household and raising children. Ironically, these supposedly becoming behaviors leave the good girl vulnerable to finding herself in unbecoming circumstances, which could include mistreatment and exploitation at best, and unaliving at worst. An unbecoming woman engages in the opposite kinds of behaviors. She speaks up and feels comfortable expressing her opinions and desires.
Picture that, Mr. Harrison. My uniform, skirt below my knees, my heels, and a simple string of pearls. Well, I don't own pearls. Lord knows you don't pay colors enough to afford pearls. And I work like a dog, day and night, living off of coffee from a pot none of you want to touch.
She takes up space and implements boundaries with others.
Don't put the pencil and paper away. You stop what you're doing right now. You're going to leave.
Hey.
The Lord's going to come after you and take you right out of this plant.
Charles. Mr. Mason, I started this, and I'm going to finish it.
She might wear pants or decide not to wear makeup because she dresses for her own personal self-expression.
Control your wives! Control your wives! It's not working!
She may choose to work or stay at home.
I've got to get out of here. I've got to get out of here. Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Just please let me handle this.
I've got to get
Calm down. Now get back to your seat. I'll take care of this. Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Doctor, you want it on the phone. Everything's gonna be all right. Please.
Sister, please, I'll handle this.
I've got to get out of here. Out of here. Out of here. I've got to get out of here.
To have children or forgo motherhood completely.
You fools, you're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! Our wives, our children, everyone!
Wait, y'all. All I'm saying is that an unbecoming woman believes in and acts with a level of self-determination that is only societally approved of for men.
We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true.
Were things so horrible, so terrifying, so hideous, there is no word to describe them.
All units. Condition red. Drain 267 is the target area. Repeat, condition red. Drain 267 is the target area.
Damn, I guess you all really don't like that, do you? But real talk, it's not easy to be an unbecoming woman. Being female in any society comes with the systemic oppression and violence inherent of patriarchal and capitalist systems. The difference is, an unbecoming woman will usually have the self-confidence and sense of agency to more skillfully navigate these systems. And because of these character traits, people may label her difficult, aggressive, the B word. Because if they can't assign her the label of the good girl, they'll go to the other extreme and say that she has. Joan Jett is a singer, songwriter, guitarist, and she was one of the founding members of the all-female band The Runaways between 1975 to 1979. Later on, she became a solo artist with her backing band, the Blackhearts, and she founded her own independent label through which she released her most well-known songs, including Bad Reputation, I Love Rock and Roll, and Crimson and Clover. Joan is known for blurring the gender binary in her videos and performances, and her mastery of the electric guitar was considered radical, even in the 70s. Back then, it was only considered acceptable for women to play acoustic guitar. The story goes that as a teenager, Joan's own guitar teacher told her that girls don't play rock and roll music. And then Mans proceeded to teach her the chords for the Appalachian folk song On Top of Old Smoky. Joan said, "Sir, be so for real right now." She never went back to those lessons and became self-taught on an electric guitar that she requested and received from her parents for Christmas. Now that's punk. Joan understood and embraced the subversiveness of being a woman who wielded the guitar like a man. Min Chin, in her 2018 Proxy Music article, Girl and Guitar, Good Luck Separating Joan Jett from Her Choice of Instrument, wrote this about Joan. As she's acknowledged, her guitar has become an extension of her person. It is who I am. Definitely it's a phallic stand-in too, but intentionally so. Jett, if no one else, is aware of how rock and roll and guitar playing are tangled up with the act and the instrument. When people told us girls couldn't play, that wasn't what they meant, she noted. That meant that girls couldn't play rock and roll because it implied, which means that they are in charge and owning it. Her reclamation of the guitar is symbolic as much as primal. End quotes. That incendiary spirit, while embracing traditional gender roles, is one of the paradoxes of rock music, especially in comparison to the original punk movement that we'll touch on later. Because although rock and roll conjures nostalgic imagery of youthful rebellion and has overlapping fashion sensibilities with punk, rock became very mainstream in its proliferation and politics. And this orientation is far removed from the genre's origins. The story of rock and roll's origins follows a similar trajectory to the story of the jazz genre. Like jazz, rock music is considered to have come out of black rhythm and blues songs. In episode 1 of this series, I talked about jazz originating in African American neighborhoods in New Orleans during the late 19th and early 20th century, and I highlighted how the use of jazz music in soundtracks in the early days of cinema in particular served as an oral shorthand for otherness because of its associations with black culture. I used the example of the first talking picture, The Jazz Singer, to show how, from the film's title to the plot line, jazz music was used to tell the story of the main character's rebellion against his Jewish cultural traditions. The appropriation of blackness in that film goes as far as having the main character perform jazz music in blackface. According to a Carnegie Hall timeline, quote, "The term rock and roll has been traced back as far as the 1920s in black music, when Trixie Smith recorded My Baby Rocks Me with One Steady Roll in 1922. It became the accepted label for this developing genre when in 1951, Cleveland disc jockey Alan Freed began calling his rhythm and blues radio show Moondog's Rock and Roll Party. Little Richard, Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and several other African-American singer, songwriter, musicians were among the first to transform the sound of rhythm and blues by introducing new musical elements." End quote. It was during the 1950s, post-World War II cultural malaise that white artists like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Jerry Lee Lewis brought rock music to the mainstream, often by doing cover songs that had previously been recorded by black artists. In the 1960s, when the Beatles came to America, sparking the British invasion of American pop and rock music, the association of rock and roll with all-white male bands was part of the mainstreaming of the genre. Women had access to limited representation, whether as vocalists in bands, or as the subjects of songs, or as the muse of male musicians. That's why all-female bands like the Runaways broke the mold for both rock and punk. These women were writing the songs, singing the vocals, and playing all of the instruments, and they were doing all of this unapologetically. When I think of someone who's unapologetic, it's a person who's brave enough to show up as their authentic self. A person willing to buck social norms, stand for a cause, and risk the consequences and possible rejection that will come from doing so. This was the ethos at the core of the punk movement, which was anti-establishment, anti-consumerism, non-conformist, and encouraged social and political engagement. In reading up on Joan Jett for this episode, in multiple sources and publications, she's referred to as the godmother of punk and the original Riot Grrrl. Now, I'd heard the term Riot Grrrl before, but I needed to familiarize myself with the background of the movement and what specifically distinguished the punk genre from rock and roll. The punk movement in the United States arose against the backdrop of the unrest of the 1960s. At that time, there was simultaneously the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the second wave women's liberation movement. In Detroit and New York City, proto-punk garage bands like the Stooges, MC5, and the New York Dolls began creating a more aggressive rock sound, which had an anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, DIY spirit, in a rejection of how mainstream and commercialized rock music had become. At first, punk was welcoming to everyone, with all-male bands like the New York Dolls drawing from drag aesthetics for the fashion and makeup worn in their performances. In Kathleen Kennedy's article, Results of a Misspent Youth, Joan Jett's performance of female masculinity, she writes of punk's influence on female musicians like Joan Jett and Blondie's Debbie Harry. Quote, "For a brief period, punk created opportunities for women that had previously not existed in rock music. Dissatisfied with stadium rock, the early punk bands developed a do-it-yourself ethics that encouraged women like Debbie Harry, Mo Tucker, and Patti Smith to join bands. Punk rejected traditional musical traditions, including those that dictated that women could not play instruments, and were wedded to sentimental, gentle, and confidential lyrics. Jett was a fan of punk and quickly integrated its sensibility into her music and performances. Specifically, punk provided Jett with these symbols from which she could explore gender and sexual inversion. These symbols were available to Jett because, at least in its beginning, punk enabled women to reimagine their roles in rock music. But in a similar trajectory to rock and roll, Kennedy writes that as punk bands began to find mainstream success, their marketing strategies slowly downplayed some of their original anti-establishment critiques. By the late 70s and early 80s, a faster, more aggressive, hardcore subgenre of punk, led by all-male bands like the Dead Kennedys and Black Flag, gradually edged women and other marginalized groups out of the movement and venue spaces. In the 1990s, the Riot Grrrl movement started in Seattle, Washington, and Washington, D.C., in response to growing misogyny within the punk subculture. The movement was led by bands such as Bikini Kill, Heavens to Betsy, and Bratmobile, and was depicted as representing a kind of punk rock feminism. Indeed, the intentional activism is what distinguished Riot Grrrl as a distinct punk subculture. Different chapters of the movement held workshops on a range of topics, including self-defense and abuse. Many young girls were drawn to the movement as an outlet for community and support after facing situations of physical and/or sexual violence. Beyond music, independent zine production and circulation was a large part of how the movement spread. In interviewing a diverse group of Riot Grrrl members for their article, Riot Grrrl, Revolutions from Within, Jessica Rosenberg and Gitana Girafalo write that, quote, "While other feminist movements have been geared more toward political action, Riot Grrrl, although remaining staunchly political, also pays attention to the personal and the everyday. It focuses more on the individual and the emotional than on marches, legislation, and public policy. This creates a community in which girls are able to speak about what is bothering them or write about what happened that day." End quote. The 3 R's in Riot Grrrl symbolize an animalistic growl and serve to portray an empowered notion of girlhood that is reimagined outside of patriarchal constructs. In Gail Wald's article, Just a Girl? Rock Music, Feminism, and the Cultural Construction of Female Youth, she writes that, quote, "In the context of Riot Grrrl performances, these images of playful and happy girlhood are attempts at self-consciously idealizing representation. Such a recuperative iconography of girlhood contrasts markedly, in some cases, with the music itself, which regularly explores themes of the violence of heteronormative beauty culture and the patriarchal infantilization and sexualization of girls. In short, themes that conjure not a lost innocence, a fall from childhood grace, but an innocence that was not owned or enjoyed, a grace that was denied. The performance of nostalgia complicates and extends the Riot Grrrl of righteous outrage at patriarchal issues. In other words, invoking a yearn for innocence and lightheartedness that retroactively rewrites the script of childhood. In the early years, the Riot Grrrl movement was predominantly made up of white, middle, and upper-class teenage girls. And this has been one of the primary critiques of the movement from its inception. The cultivation and performance of a girlish identity and aesthetics is a strategy that has been used by artists like Gwen Stefani, Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, and contemporary artists like Taylor Swift and Sabrina Carpenter in fostering female youth subculture. It's a profitable strategy, for white women at least, because their perceived innocence is marketable. As noted in Rosenberg and Girafalo's article, racial segregation of U.S. neighborhoods is one of the causes for the movement's lack of diversity. But there's also the unequal experience of white and black girlhood. In research published by institutions including the American Academy of Pediatrics and Georgetown University, it shows that the adultification of black girls happens at earlier ages than their white counterparts. In school settings, this often manifests in black girls being given harsher punishments because they're presumed less innocent, and their behavior is judged against adult expectations. Black girls are more likely to be perceived as promiscuous and to be hypersexualized. This traces back to the overall hypersexualization of black girls and women during slavery, which was used to deny them the protections that are supposed to come with femininity. Given the racial disparities in the experience of girlhood, It's questionable whether the reclamation of girlhood and appropriation of girlhood aesthetics makes the Riot Grrrl movement any different from the overall second wave feminist movement, which prioritized the concerns and experiences of white women. Going back to Gail Wald's article, the cultivation of a girlish identity to market records and merch to a young female audience plays right into the machine of patriarchal capitalism. Wald gave the example of Gwen Stefani when she was the lead vocalist of the rock band No Doubt, and the lyrics and persona Stefani crafted around one of the band's most popular songs, Just a Girl. Wald writes, quote, "Just as I'm Just a Girl plays cleverly with the codes of good girl, bad girl femininity, so Stefani's performance is carefully calibrated to display elements of quote-unquote transgressive femininity without abandoning the principle that a female rock musician's pretty face is the ultimate source of her commercial popularity and, therefore, cultural authority. The point here is not merely that girlish innocence sells records, but that Stefani's sarcastic discourse of helpless, innocent girlhood simultaneously functions as a strategy of feminism and a strategy of commerce, where feminism and commerce exist in a complex and shifting, rather than a simple and binary relation to one another. Staged, in other words, within the very corporate institutions that are agents of dominant discourses that divest women of cultural power. Stefani's performance of infantile, girlish femininity may be symbolically, if not actually, redundant." End quote. In summary, Gail said, "Child, you ain't transgressing nothing." Like the overall mainstreaming and corporatization of rock and roll, whether it's girlhood spelled the standard way or girlhood with a grrrl, focusing on a feminism rooted in a narrative that's culturally specific to white girls and women removes much of the anti-establishment, anti-capitalist subversion once claimed by the original punk movement. So, if I wanted to show examples of a group who hasn't been compromised and whose mere existence in everyday life is an act of political defiance, I need look no further than Black girls and women. I would argue, in fact, that being a Black female musician, regardless of your chosen genre, makes you. In reviewing the research and reflecting on the artists that I wanted to profile for this episode, it was clear that despite the contribution of Black artists to rock and punk music, the erasure of them from the forefront of these genres has been thorough. So I went back to the origin stories to highlight some pioneering Black women in rock and punk music. Our first artist highlight is Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who's known as the godmother of rock and roll. Not only was Tharpe revolutionary for blurring the line between secular and spiritual music by mixing gospel music with electric guitar, as a woman, a Black woman, playing guitar in the 1930s and 40s, within some church circles, what she and her music represented was outright blasphemous. You good? Tharpe's guitar playing technique, which used heavy distortion, laid the groundwork for future artists like Little Richard, Elvis Presley, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, and Tina Turner. Tina Turner was born Anna Mae Bullock on November 26, 1939, in Brownsville, Tennessee. Her family lived in a rural community where her father worked as an overseer on a sharecropping farm, and where Tina herself remembered working at a young age picking cotton. When she was 11, her mother unexpectedly left the family and moved to St. Louis to escape her father's abuse. At 13, Tina's father married another woman and moved to Detroit, leaving Tina and her sisters in the care of their maternal grandmother. In 1958, she began her singing career under the stage name Little Ann, but 1960 is when she became Tina Turner. She met Ike Turner at a nightclub in St. Louis and became a featured vocalist in his band, King of Rhythms. Ike created the Ike and Tina Revue, and they traveled across the US performing at clubs and hotels along the Chitlin circuit. Eventually, their performances were so profitable that they were able to perform at some desegregated venues throughout the South. In 1962, she and Ike got married, but he was a violent and volatile husband, and the abuse that she suffered at his hands over the course of their marriage has been documented elsewhere. In 1976, Tina divorced Ike, and after a brief lull, she went on to forge her own solo music career, performing well into the 2010s. Some of her defining hits include What's Love Got to Do With It?, The Best, and Private Dancer. Tina is one of only 3 female artists to have ever been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. The first time was with her ex-husband Ike in 1991, though neither of them attended the ceremony, and then again for her solo career in 2021. In 2018, she also received the Grammys Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2005, she received Kennedy Center honors. The Queen of Rock and Roll would go on to become one of the best-selling artists of all time, with over 100 million records sold worldwide. In the description box, I'll link to a Rolling Stone magazine slideshow titled Black Women Who Shaped Rock and Roll, which has profiles of other artists including Alice Coltrane, the Ronettes, the Supremes, and Gertrude Ma Rainey. The word Undone was inspired by Wally Lamb's book titled She's Come Undone, which I read over a decade ago. And while I couldn't tell you any of the details about the actual plot of that story, the title has always been memorable. Because it's a decadent way of saying, oh, she had a nervous breakdown. I think if you desire to be an unbound woman, coming undone is a critical part of the process. I'll explain further in the video, but first, we need to distinguish what's real from what's fake. I was familiar with many of the women featured on that Rolling Stones list, but 2 of the artists, Betty Davis and Polly Styrene, were new to me. As luck would have it, the streaming platform Canopy had documentaries of each of these ladies, available for free. The first film was called Polly Styrene, I Am a Cliché, which is a profile of Marianne Joan Elliott Said, better known by her stage name, Polly Styrene. In the 1970s, Polly, as she was called, was the frontwoman for the British band X-Ray Spex. Now everything about Polly's backstory, from her fashion to her career and life in general, is the definition of punk. Polly was biracial, having been born to a Scottish-Irish mother and Somali father who had immigrated to the UK. Her mother was a single mother, and being half-caste, as was the terminology used at the time, Polly never felt like she fit in as a mixed-race girl growing up in 1960s Britain. In her teen years, Polly was a hippie, and at 15 she ran away from home and hitchhiked her way around the UK attending music festivals. After seeing an early performance by the Sex Pistols, Polly was inspired to form X-Ray Spex. And in true DIY punk fashion, she outfitted herself with dental braces and quirky homemade outfits in defiance of the traditional sexualization of women in music. Rolling Stone magazine described her as, quote, one of the most unconventional rock front persons in history. Through songs like Bondage Up Yours and Germ-Free Adolescence, Polly sang about the banality of everyday life. the thing she said no one else was singing about. Ironically, in the documentary, Polly's daughter Celeste said that her mother wasn't necessarily ideological and probably wouldn't identify as a feminist. In fact, Polly often complained that she had to work, and she wished she could be a lady of leisure. She had picked the name polystyrene out of the Yellow Pages because to her it meant something that was, quote, just plastic, disposable. That's what a pop star sort of meant to me, end quote. A turning point for Polly occurred when her band went to New York City to play a residency at the infamous CBGB Music Club. The hectic performance schedule, the plastic consumerism culture, the bright lights and overstimulation of the city as a whole proved to be too much. In her diary, Polly wrote, quote, I saw everything that I'd been writing about in Extreme, but for real. This New York portion of the documentary is what resonated the most in Polly's story, because she had such a prescience about where society was heading in terms of everything being literally and figuratively plastic.
I muse over the future and all it may bring. I open Pandora's box of hope. I envision a time in the distant future when synthetics rule. The downside, humankind destroy the natural environment. The upside, burgers will be cruelty-free veggie rubber buns.
Celeste said that the CBGB and New York experience destroyed whatever innocence her mother had left after being exposed to the city's seedy underbelly. When Polly returned to the UK, she began to have a slow withdrawal from reality, which included shaving her head and seeing visions. She wound up being hospitalized and misdiagnosed at first with schizophrenia, then later being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She was told she would never work again. The next documentary was titled Betty, They Say I'm Different, and it was a profile of funk singer-songwriter Betty Davis, who was known as the godmother of funk. Betty was born Betty Mabry in Durham, North Carolina in 1944, where her grandmother introduced her to blues music, and at the age of 10, Betty wrote her first song, I'm Going to Bake That Cake of Love. Betty's family later relocated to Homestead, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, so her father could take a job at the local steel mill. She was close to her dad, and the documentary didn't provide any background on her mother, so the two defining relationships of her childhood seemed to have been mainly with her father and her grandmother. At 16, Betty moved to New York City to attend school at the Fashion Institute of Technology. In the documentary, her friend Connie says that she chose independence, and that was something that women didn't have. In NYC, Betty lived with an aunt and worked as a model to support herself. Through modeling, she became associated with the artistic crowd of the Greenwich Village neighborhood, where she met musicians like Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone. In 1964, Betty transitioned from modeling to singing when she secured a recording contract with Don Costa, who arranged albums for artists including Frank Sinatra. It was through her relationship and marriage to legendary jazz trumpeter Miles Davis in 1968 that Betty Mabry became Betty Davis. Miles was 18 years Betty's senior, and he viewed her as a muse. It was through Betty that Miles was introduced to Jimi Hendrix and the Greenwich Village crowd, and she is credited for influencing his transition from Italian suits to a more psychedelic 70s fashion sense, and his addition of electronic instruments to his later compositions. But the marriage to Miles Davis was a difficult one, and it's alleged in the documentary that though Betty didn't tell anyone outright, he may have been violent with her. Miles and Betty would divorce after 1 year. There's no known footage of Betty's performances during this time, but the controversy she created with her lyrics and live performances was documented. Through songs like He Was a Big Freak, Nasty Gal, and If I'm in Luck, I Might Get Picked Up, we can infer that Betty didn't really do things subtly. Her performances, which were described as burlesque style by a concertgoer, were deemed too raunchy and provocative for the mainstream. This resulted in Betty being boycotted by radio and TV stations and receiving condemnation from the NAACP. Because remember, this was the era of the civil rights movement. And with the respectability politics of trying to secure basic legal rights for Black Americans on the line, the organization was like, sis,
please, baby, get in the house, get in the house. White people are looking at you.
White music executives kept trying to convince Betty to change in order to be more marketable. Nevertheless, she was defiant. Betty is quoted in the documentary as saying, "I have never let my being Black interfere with what I wanted to do. You should always know who you are and just do what you have to do." Her friend Winona, who was interviewed, said the first time she saw Betty perform on stage, her mouth dropped open.
The raunchiness of these songs that she was belting out in this deep, gravelly voice, I was just taken aback. What Betty did as a performer, every woman would love to do. What she wanted to say in her performance, there were no other women doing it. When you're ahead of your times, can also mean that you're ahead of your country. And they're just not ready or willing to accept who you are. And, you know, let's not forget, she is a Black woman. So she started off the race from behind the rest.
In 1980, Betty's father died, and she returned to Homestead, Pennsylvania. Similar to Polly's story, the loss was a point of no return for her. Losing a parent mirrored the loss of innocence for Betty in the way that New York City was a loss of innocence for Polly. At a certain point, Betty too ended up in a hospital with what was implied to be schizophrenic symptoms. She describes that time period as being in a void, and the documentary leaves vague the full details of her mental state. Betty never returned to music, instead choosing to remain in Homestead and live a quiet life. Despite her obvious talent, model looks, and the controversy she caused in her time, she's still relatively unknown and remains an underground cult figure. As summed up by the site Light in the Attic, quote, "One can hardly imagine the genre-busting, culture-crossing musical magic of Janelle Monáe, Outkast, Prince, Erykah Badu, Rick James, The Roots, or Madonna without the influence of R&B pioneer Betty Davis. Rappers from Ice Cube to Talib Kweli to Ludacris have rhymed over her intensely strong but sensual music. Yet somehow, Miss Davis's unique story, still widely unknown, is unlike any other in popular music." End quote. Watching Polly and Betty's documentaries left an unexpected sadness that's still with me almost a month after viewing them. Because despite both of these women now being recognized as trailblazers, There are similar trajectories of exploitation and extraction by the music industry, and the mental health struggles are reminders that there are parameters around who gets to be unbecoming and unapologetic in public and private spheres. Their stories also reiterated how unprotected women are, even when surrounded by male bandmates, managers, producers, boyfriends, and spouses. As in daily life, in the music industry, women of color will always face more resistance and backlash for showing up as their authentic selves and going against the grain. For Black women especially, respectability politics reinforces the high intersectional costs of race and gender that one will have to pay. In the March Resonance Journal for Home Frequency, I talked about how sometimes the best thing we can do is allow ourselves to come undone intentionally. And I think Polly and Betty's stories are examples of how that process can be facilitated. Now, disclaimer, I'm not a medical professional. I'm just a spiritual being having a human experience in this metaphysical universe. And I'm constantly trying to make the connections within that overall experience. I think a lot of times what the medical field calls a nervous breakdown is actually a nervous breakthrough. It's implied in both documentaries that Betty and Polly started hearing voices during their hospitalizations, which led to diagnoses of schizophrenia. But it got me wondering, what if crises, loss, having the artifice of reality stripped away, enabled the truth to finally break through? What if the voice or voices being heard is the narrative of your old identity being overwritten by the narrative of the new? The word Unbound was inspired by Kasia Urbaniak's book by that title. According to her bio, Kasia previously worked as a professional dominatrix, and she practiced Taoist alchemy at a female-led monastery in China. She runs a school called the Academy, where she instructs women about the foundations of power and influence. She teaches women to give voice to their wants and desires, how to be forthright in asking for things, and how to negotiate interactions and the resistance that will inevitably come from going against the good girl's behaviors. For women, letting go of identities like the good girl is a fundamental part of the process of unbecoming. Unfortunately, for many, it usually takes some kind of inciting incident like the loss of a loved one or a job to initiate the process, by causing everything around them, and sometimes within them, to come undone. But if you are willing to sit with the discomfort and see the process through to completion, you have the opportunity to architect a new identity based on alignment with your most authentic self. The decisions Betty and Polly made to walk away from the glitz and glamour of the music industry as a matter of self-preservation is an example of choosing to forego social validation in order to honor oneself. The kind of introspection and self-reckoning both Polly and Betty displayed in their journal entries and voiceovers throughout their respective films shows two women who were internally oriented and spiritually attuned in a way that most people actively avoid becoming. When you think of how uncomfortable most people are sitting in silence or being alone with their own thoughts, they're denying themselves access to a level of self-knowledge and self-mastery, which is necessary to attain self-sovereignty. At the beginning of the video, I stated that, to me, an unbound woman is one who is physically, mentally, spiritually, and financially sovereign. And part of getting to this state is defining the standards of each of those parameters for oneself. In other words, a lifestyle that may be considered peaceful to one person may be too hectic for another. And things like spirituality and finances are so specific to each person's circumstance. So it's important to understand what provides you fulfillment and to create your own definitions of abundance and success. I won't give spoilers for the endings of either Polly or Betty's stories, but I can say that I think in their own ways, both of them reached the status of unbound women. Joan Jett and Tina Turner are the two other artists that, based on what I read, also fit the definition. Joan is still actively touring today and able to reap the respect and rewards that she's earned. In 2015, she and her band, the Blackhearts, were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Through her label Blackheart Records, which she founded in 1980, and a distribution deal with Sony Music, Joan has been able to release her music while retaining ownership of her masters, which is rare for artists. In addition, she has a stock portfolio that has enabled her to be a full-time musician for 5 decades and counting. That's not just punk, that's gangster. One of the most inspiring women and stories, though, has to be Tina Turner's. As impressive as her career accomplishments were, what I admire most is how she reclaimed her peace post-divorce and used her solo artist success to restart and reshape her life. In the 1980s, she fell in love with German music producer Erwin Bach, whom she later married, and in the mid-90s they moved to a lakeside villa in a wealthy suburb of Zurich, Switzerland. In 2013, Tina renounced her US citizenship after becoming a Swiss citizen, and she lived a peaceful, private life there until her recent passing in 2023. Now that is a masterclass in architecting one's sovereignty. Man, we covered a lot of ground in this episode. From the roots of rock and roll to the DIY spirit of punk and the Riot Grrrl movement, we saw how women like Joan Jett, Betty Davis, and Poly Styrene didn't just participate in these genres, they disrupted them. They challenged expectations, rejected limitations, and created space to exist on their own terms. And what ties all of this together is a kind of reauthoring process, which consists of unbecoming who your family and society told you to be, being apologetic in how you show up consistently, allowing yourself to come undone intentionally so that you can ultimately become unbound and live a sovereign life authentically. And that's not just a cultural movement, that's a personal one. If this way of thinking resonates with you, this is the work we go deeper into inside Reauthor, the Sounding of the Sonic Identity Lab, which is the inaugural Inner Homie cohort of my home frequency community. It's a space where we explore how sound, narrative, and identity intersect, and how to consciously reshape the patterns, stories, roles like the good girl that you've subconsciously inherited, so you can begin architecting a sovereign life on your own terms. You can learn more about home frequency and Reauthor at the link in the description. And if you would like to support this work, please share this episode, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being here, and remember to stay tuned, stay present, and listen for what's amplified. TTYL.